saving nature on a dynamic planet. So much of conservation is looking at as if we're a snapshot in time, but actually things are changing as we speak, as we breathe. So the world is suffering from fragmentation, and it begins with the conservation community itself. There are those who believe in the atmosphere as the main issue and those who believe in the biosphere. It's about carbon emissions on one side, but it's about the interaction of species and the planet to create all life on Earth. And this has to stop because most of the attention is going to the atmosphere at the demise of the biosphere. We've had unprecedented, an epidemic of fragmentation around the world, and Australia has been one of the leaders in land clearing around the world. It's not just the Amazon, it's an epidemic. And of course, the epidemic itself, that we're all suffering from COVID, has its origins in fragmentation in Southeast Asia. Ask Eddie Holmes at Sydney Uni, who's been a leader in studying the origins of the epidemic. Add to climate change, everything we know about fragmentation is exacerbated. Species don't have the room to roam. They can't adapt to the changing environmental conditions. It just makes matters worse. So climate and biodiversity crisis, they fit together. They are interdependent. And the tip of the spear of fragmentation has been linear infrastructure development. Roads, rails, canals, all over the world. We did an assessment, my organization did an assessment of 28 nations in Asia. 2/3 of the new infrastructure will be new footprint. Where's it going to go? It's going to go in the areas of high biodiversity or where indigenous people don't have rights. And the thing about roads, and this is an understudy, and I want to create a global community to study this, is that their impact, their direct impact on species, conservation, biodiversity is much greater and is so understudied that we don't even have a handle on the problem. You know, we study about Tasmanian devils and the 2 types of transmissible cancers that are affecting Tasmanian devils. But does anyone talk about the hundreds that are killed on roads in Tasmania? There are 100 billion large mammals per year that are killed just in road accidents, and the roads themselves have a disturbance effect that goes kilometers, 12, 15 kilometers beyond the roads. And every road that you know right now is going to double in the next 20 to 25 years. So connectivity conservation has arisen as a countermeasure to fragmentation. The funny thing is the science has been around for 70 years, but it was only last year that we had a global definition for this issue. And it's about saving the dynamic aspects of nature, both at the species level and the natural process level. Make sure I got this right. Okay, so here's connectivity, a fragmented world. Well, the kind of main strategy for conservation has been the protected area. And I live about an hour and a half outside of Yellowstone National Park in Montana. And as you can see, a lot of people don't recognize that Yellowstone Park, the first park created in 1872, sorry about the Royal National Park, is a box, right? You know, and this is our standard for conservation and still is promoted as a standard for conservation. And it's more of a pattern-based approach to conservation in a process-based world. And when you manage the landscape as a box, you do really kind of perverse things. And this is the way, really, we have public and private lands exist in a checkerboard fashion in the western United States as a giveaway to the railroad companies so that they would invest in building rail across the country. So this isn't the way ecology works, is it? So I just want to, as we get into connectivity conservation, have to evolve our thinking about where conservation is going. We're using a 19th century model for conservation to deal with 21st century issues relating to how nature works. And so the big take-home message is that conservation happens on all lands and waters, not just in protected areas. And that connectivity is more than just wildlife corridors. It has to deal with all the ecological functions that require movement to sustain nature, to sustain life, to deal with that interdependence that is what ecology is all about. Simply, connectivity, the more connected, the better. And I like to use the metaphor that while parks and protected areas are organs of nature, we're really doing a bad job of saving the circulatory system of nature. In fact, we're doing a horrible job about that. So simply, connectivity is about protecting those connections, conserving those connections, and mitigating where we have disrupted or fragmented the landscape. And we want to do that in a way that where the world is fragmented, we want to use as many connectivity tools to create linkages or corridors between nature to create essentially wild ways or networks, ecological networks, that connect the bits of land of high value nature that we have around the world. One of the ways we did this, and many of you in this room were involved, is that we had to create a new type of conservation protection. There's a protected area, there's the OECM, or what they call conserved areas, and we've added to the lexicon ecological corridors. Now, a lot of people don't like the term corridors because it's too linear, but frankly, that's how the policy world talks about connectivity, because when you say connectivity, they're thinking about cell phones. So we're using the language of policy to make change here. And ecological corridors are a new type of designation. They're not solely protected areas. It's where people live. You have to have these public-private agreements. But it adds to the fact that we're trying to save this connectivity value between protected areas or high biodiversity areas in a fragmented world. So for instance, in India, you have where half the world's tigers exist in the wild, central India, there are these small protected areas. And we need to protect the connectivity between these protected areas to save the tigers. If we don't designate these areas in some form or have some kind of private land agreement or indigenous land agreement, those areas are open for linear infrastructure development. India wants to create a superhighway system like every other developed nation in the world. And where are they going to put it? They're going to put it in these zones between the protected areas. And how's that going to affect tiger conservation or any species conservation around the world? It's a race right now. And if we don't have a tool in connectivity, we're going to lose that race. So it's a highway system in our world. It's a wild way system in nature's world. And we have to fit the two together. So we've been looking at, essentially the diffusion of connectivity science into policy and practice. And over the last 30 years, we looked at 500 plans, and we've seen that there's been this exponential growth across all continents in implementing connectivity as a new conservation practice. Oceania, or Australia, is a laggard, and the reason why you're a laggard is because your policies are not keeping up with policies in other parts of the world. Your science is world leading, but your policy is shit. Now, to help support this growing practice, and it's exponential, and I want to thank IFAL for supporting us, the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, and I succeeded Graham Warboys, who was a fantastic leader. But, it began about 6 years ago with about 400 members, and we're already 1,300 members. We're one of the largest specialist groups in IUCN to support the science, policy, and practice. And we're in 130 nations. And as you can see on this map, Australia is one of our key membership areas. The guidelines, which were the first international guidelines of how do you take the science and apply it to practice, was created just a couple years ago. It's the #1 downloaded document from IUCN, and a lot of people in this room were involved. We had a workshop about it. Here was the members of the workshop. All their ideas are incorporated into this document. We disagreed on terminology, but that's another story. Part of the issue about these guidelines is that connectivity is not just terrestrial. A lot of people think, oh, it's terrestrial. The aquatic folks were way ahead on connectivity for many years, and the people working on dams will tell you about that. The marine world says, hey, connectivity is all about what we do. We have the water column to deal with. And frankly, the science on connectivity is so rich, there's a whole debate about structural connectivity and functional connectivity and connectivity gradients that, we're always trying to apply the new science into practice as soon as it comes out. So that's what our specialist group is trying to do. As the idea of science gets diffused into public policy, every major multilateral environmental agreement is now taking up connectivity. Just a year ago, the United Nations General Assembly had a unanimous resolution to say that connectivity matters. Nature knows no borders. And every other major environmental agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention on Ecosystem, or the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, all now have some kind of connectivity target. In fact, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which used to say well connected, now has connectivity spread across now it's 4 targets. I didn't put target 4. and major goal. And we're trying to get a headline indicator that it's not just 30% protected by 2030, it's 30% protected and connected by 2030. While the world waits for any kind of united global action on this, every nation is working in some form on connectivity. And led by Bhutan, and that's Paul Beyer who works with me, to help create the plan for Bhutan, where 50% of Bhutan is protected, and a lot of it based on these biological corridors, ecological corridors that they created. There's Tanzania, which has came out, and that's Christine Penrod who wrote that plan as a new official policy for Tanzania. Many nations are creating national level connectivity policy. Where are you, Australia? Canada, the least fragmented nation perhaps in the world, has a whole program to support connectivity because they don't want to become fragmented. They want to get ahead of the game. And they've invested $2.3 billion into this work. In the US, we have a national corridor bill coming out. It's been passed twice by the House. We hope in the latter months of this year we'll have the Senate pass and we'll have our own national policy in the US. But in the meantime, just like in Australia, you have states. And the states can take action. And in the last 3 years, 18 different US states said we're going to have connectivity policies. And even regions have created, between Canadian provinces and US states, have created agreements on connectivity in lieu of having national policies. And what I see very interesting about connectivity is that it not only connects landscapes, it connects people, and it connects NGOs. India has some of the most competitive NGO environments in the world, but you have organizations who compete against each other now collaborating because they know it is an all-hands-on-deck moment, and they have to work in a different fashion to essentially address this issue across the scale of nature. And part of the specialist group's work is trying to figure out how do we innovate civil engineering, how do we innovate the work in winter infrastructure. And Rodney Vandery has been a leader in writing these new guidelines, just like we had for corridors or connectivity guidelines. We're having technical guidelines on how do you deal with linear infrastructure, and Rodney's been a lead author, and he's one of our speakers today. But some of the more interesting things is that connectivity is now infiltrating into the whole restoration realm. So the UN Convention on Combating Desertification has created essentially the global guidelines for what they call the Global Land Outlook, and they say connectivity matters to restoration. It's not just protecting the high biodiversity areas. It's about scaling up restoration to ecologically significant ways. So their concept is restore to connect. That's our traditional conservation biology approach. You have these protected areas and you're trying to connect connections between them. But also it's connect to restore, where you're trying to take these various restoration efforts and scale them up so that they have continental-wide impact, such as the Great Green Wall of Africa. And here in Australia, connectivity matters because I think this is where the new frontier is that the conditions for life is changing. We need more resilience in our landscapes and seascapes. And connectivity is one of the few ecological practices that provides that resilience, because more intact systems are able to buffer the big flood, the big fire, the big changes in environmental conditions, the extreme events. And that's why efforts like the Great Eastern Ranges matter so much. And essentially copying the Great Eastern Ranges, the second 100-year plan for the Appalachian Trail, our iconic landscape in the East Coast, is now trying to create an East Coast climate corridor. And it's not just about protecting the landscape that surrounds this Appalachian Trail, this iconic trail. It's about how we protect the watershed for 120 million people. How do we keep the Smokies smoky? How do we make sure that we have resilience to the changing environmental conditions? And connectivity is vital for that. So I show you three landscapes here. One is one where I spent my initial years in conservation, 10 years in Africa, the Albertine Rift. I came back to the US to work on something called Yellowstone to Yukon. And I married an Australian who introduced me to the Great Eastern Ranges. So these kind of efforts are global and they're growing around the world. And in fact, there are thousands of these large-scale efforts that are based on connectivity. but you don't know them because they've been below the radar screen. It's been a bottom-up solution to a large-scale problem. Across jurisdictions, across cultures, across geographies, people are responding in a similar way to the cumulative impacts on the ground. Now, the whole discussion of 30 by 30 is that we're just going to have more protected areas, and we need more protected areas, no doubt about it. But if you map the protected areas on a blue background here, you're going to have more blobs. We have a measles problem here. There's no connectivity of these blobs. Michelle Ward and folks at UQ study that only 10% of protected area systems are connected. We have little connectivity within our protected area networks. In fact, we don't have networks in reality. So we really have to do more in the future. As we create more protected areas, we have to make sure they're more connected. The thing is that connectivity has to count. We have to put it into policy. It has to be recognized as a value that we want to save. We have to measure it. Simon Ferrier is here. I see him up there. Has been a leading counter of connectivity, giving us the analytic tools. But connectivity is so different across species, across landscapes. We have different ways of measurement. And it makes it hard for policymakers with regards to, well, what tool should I use? We're trying to help create a very simple tool. This just came out a couple weeks ago in terms of how do you measure connectivity. And we're not trying to measure the ecological function. We're just trying to measure connectivity between protected areas. So right now, let's say this is your protected area system, these blobs. 30 by 30, we're going to create more blobs, and we want more blobs. But now we want to measure the connection between these blobs, how many there are between them, the quality of those connections. And we also want to say that these connections are not just to other protected areas. Biodiversity is not just found in protected areas. It's in key biodiversity areas. It's in these OECMs. It's in private reserves. And we need to have functional connectivity between these different kinds of conservation tools. So all of this adds up to landscapes. As I said, there are thousands of these large landscape efforts. In the US, we've created a network of 450 large landscapes who all use connectivity. This is just 125 of them mapped. If we put up the other 300, it would just look as one color. But there is this movement out here around the world about how we work together collaboratively. In the audience, there are about 10 people from the United States who've come with indigenous leaders to work with their colleagues in Australia and New Zealand to see how we can build this global network. They call themselves the Global Stewardship Network. I hope you'll go out and talk to them. We represent the Network for Landscape Conservation in the US. The sad part about landscape conservation, they have one problem. They don't talk to each other. And they're really reinventing the wheel. And if we want to accelerate this process of large-scale conservation based on connectivity, we have to have more communication, more coordination between these efforts. And that's what we're here to work with you all on. So I hope that you all will join us and connect with us. And we thank you. The world thanks the world for all the science and enthusiasm on connectivity that's come in Australia. But we want to give it back to you, and now it's your turn to take the lead here.